Hey everybody, it's Matthew Braga. I'm the senior technology reporter for CBC News, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the ransomware attack that started last week and kind of continued into the weekend a little bit. It's known as the WannaCry ransomware, WannaCrypter. It's sort of the latest variant of ransomware that's going around, but with a little bit of a twist, right? Because in the past, you've probably heard of ransomware attacks where it's spread via you open an attachment that you get in an email, or you click on a link, let's say, or you visit a malicious website. But in this particular case, what made the attack so effective was that it used this vulnerability, this software flaw that allowed it to spread, like a worm from computer to computer. So once you kind of had one vulnerable computer within, a company or a school that was infected, it could spread very quickly to those other computers and then spread to other computers and on and on and on. And that's why we kind of saw this big spike on Friday amongst vulnerable systems. So that's sort of the thing that happened then. And into the weekend, I think a lot of people were concerned, right, that this was going to keep spreading. And it was a little bit of a stroke of luck because, there were some security researchers who were looking at this ransomware, and they found that it had a kill switch contained inside of it. And they found a way to sort of activate that switch and prevent it from, spreading further once it had infected particular machines. And so, coming into the week, I think there was a little bit of a concern that there'd be a spike, as people kind of came in and turned on their computers and returned from the work week. But I think these the kill switch and sort of the kill switches and sort of other variants that researchers discovered over the weekend, I think kind of helped temper that spread a little bit as well. So that's sort of the lay of the land, and I think we are going to we're going to be answering a few questions from readers. So if you have any questions about sort of ransomware in general, if you want to know about this particular instance, if you want to know what you can do to kind of protect yourself, you can send us questions through Facebook or through YouTube, and we'll try our best to answer things best as you can. So yeah, it was it was certainly a busy weekend for those of us who keep an eye on this sort of thing. That's for sure. One of the things that I thought was kind of notable, and I think I mentioned this in I wrote up a story that was on the CBC News website last Friday, and I mentioned before that part of what made this ransomware spread so quickly was the fact that it exploited the software flaw that let it jump from computer to computer. You didn't even have to do anything. You didn't have to click on a link or open an attachment, and it was interesting because the software flaw was actually was part of a toolkit of NSA. It's the National Security Agency, the intelligence agency of the States. They have all these sort of tools that they use for espionage, and a group known as the Shadow Brokers leaked some of these tools starting last year, and the most recent batch was leaked in April. And it turned out that one of the sort of tools in this sort of trove that was leaked was it was code that exploited this particular software flaw that the ransomware authors used last week. So it's sort of interesting. A lot of people have reported that this ransomware was sort of enabled or got so much of its power because it used this repurposed code that was once written by the NSA. So that's sort of interesting. So Chris McLean wants to know how many have paid the blackmailers. So it's interesting. So there is a Twitter account that someone from the website Court set up, and you can go and you can look at sort of the sort of money coming in yourself. But what they've done is they've set up this it's this Twitter bot, and it keeps track of all the people who are paying money into these Bitcoin wallets that the criminals have set up. So I guess to back up a little bit. So for those who don't know, ransomware typically, files, you're infected with ransomware, and your files are then sort of locked up. They're encrypted, and generally the attackers demand some sort of ransom, right? They demand some sort of payment in response, or in return they'll give you sort of this key that they can use to kind of decrypt your files, and you can gain access again. And the way that they usually demand payment is, it's not like you're entering in your credit card information, or you're going to some PayPal link. It's they're asking you to pay in Bitcoin. Which is this, it's this digital currency that is difficult to trace, and this is how they demanded payment in this particular case. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin is you can actually see, there's this public ledger, and you can see all the transactions that are, flying back and forth, across the sort of Bitcoin network. And so researchers found that, this particular ransomware, the money was going into three Bitcoin wallet addresses that, because again, Bitcoin is public, anyone could track the money that was flowing into it and potentially the money that was, flowing out of it if the attackers decided to take the money out of it. And so, roundabout way, someone has set up a bot to kind of track, how much money is flowing into these accounts. And last check, I think it's about $60,000. I believe that's in US dollars that has flown into this account at this point, which not a terribly high amount for the number of computers that were affected and for the amount of damage I think that was done. Okay, so we've got some more questions here. Valerie Harrison says, Google put out a patch. Is that true? Can you expand on that? So Valerie, I think maybe what you might be referring to, or what you might have heard, was that Microsoft was, I think, the one that kind of put out the main patch here that people are talking about. So to back up a little bit, I think I had mentioned before, this particular strain of ransomware affected, there was a flaw in all versions of Windows, from Windows XP all the way to Windows 10. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that, Microsoft supports, they have supported versions of Windows and they have unsupported versions of Windows. And once versions of Windows get past a certain age, they're no longer supported, right? Microsoft says, it's not worth our time anymore to keep on releasing patches for the software. You should upgrade to something newer. So in Microsoft world, everything from Windows Vista, Service Pack 2, all the way up to Windows 10 received a patch for the software flaw back in March. So if you installed this patch back in March, and this ransomware landed on your system, it wouldn't have, where at least it wouldn't have been able to kind of get into your system the way that it spread, right? It patched up the hole that the ransomware used to spread, and so you probably would have been fine. The trouble was, where people either were running Windows XP, which is an unsupported version of Microsoft Windows, and so there was no patch, at least initially, for this particular flaw, or you were running a later version of Windows and you just didn't install the software update. So, you had an update since maybe before March, and, it's potentially possible that you could have been, infected with this particular, strain of ransomware. Now, over the weekend, it kind of became apparent that, clearly this was spreading so much because of a combination of people running older versions of Windows, like Windows XP, and also hadn't patched their software. And so Microsoft took the unusual step of releasing a, a software patch that they were able to, deliver to Windows XP users, which is not something that they normally do. It was a little bit out of the ordinary. So I'm going to take a look at the next question we've got here. So we've got a question from Donna May Lee, and she's wondering, what will this virus do to a home computer? So I think I mentioned before, this is a type of malware, a type of virus called ransomware. And for those who aren't familiar, for those who haven't, who have had the good fortune of not having a computer that's been infected with ransomware, what happens is, you get infected with ransomware either by, clicking on a link perhaps, or, opening an email or opening an attachment. That's sort of, the most common ways in which you're infected. But in this particular case, you didn't actually have to do anything, right? This was a worm that was able to travel from computer to, vulnerable computer to vulnerable computer, computers that hadn't been patched, without you having to do anything. And so once this ransomware lands on your computer, what it does is, it usually scans for a bunch of, common files, right? So maybe it'll scan for photos and music and documents and other things that you probably hold near and dear. And what it'll do is it'll encrypt those files. And so, encryption you've probably heard about in the past because, it's used to kind of keep, your messages safe when you send them across the internet, or, used to kind of protect your computer, right? If someone steals your computer and it's encrypted, then, they can't get in without your password. But, encryption is sort of what we call a dual-use technology, and so it can be used for good, but it can also, be kind of abused, as we've seen in this case. It can be kind of turned against people, and so what happens is that, these attackers have decided to encrypt all of your files with a key that only they have, and they kind of hold your files hostage, where, if you don't pay in Bitcoin, then they're not gonna give up your files. But, there are some exceptions to that, and we can get to that in a little bit, perhaps. So we've got another question here, and it is from Ed Goddard. Are cell phones vulnerable? And Jesse Diane Ryan wants to know if it's also affecting iPhones. So these are great questions, right? Typically, when we think of ransomware, typically, I think the most common variants only really affect, they affect Microsoft Windows computers, they affect Macintosh computers. We've seen some variants that affect Linux, and there's been some rare cases actually where yes, ransomware has popped up on Android phones in particular. The reason why Android phones in particular is because you have a lot more license to install software and apps from all these various sources on Android phones compared to iPhones, right? There are exceptions, of course, but Androids, are designed in such a way where you can install, you can download an app from your computer and you can load it on your phone. You can download apps from app stores other than Google's, and in some cases, there's even been apps that have they've snuck into Google's App Store and they've had sort of malicious code hiding inside of them. And so, what we found is that when you see sort of ransomware on phones, typically it's been the sort that applies to certain Android phones, and often Android phones that have been sort of modified to accept apps from untrusted sources. That's sort of the key here, right? Is you want to make sure that you're, unless you know what you're doing, that you're installing apps only from trusted sources like Google's App Store, and that you're running the most recent versions of, Google's Android operating system. And unfortunately, this is sort of another one of those problems with Android phones, is that depending on the model you have, depending on the carrier you're with, sometimes you won't always get the most recent software updates, but those most recent sort of security patches. And so that can cause some problems as well. So the short version is that the attack that we saw over the weekend, from Friday into the weekend, only affected computers running certain versions of Microsoft Windows, versions that hadn't been patched specifically, and did not affect Android phones or iPhones. But that's not to say that malware for phones does not exist. So next question. Anjanea Sood wants to know, are Mac computers affected by this virus? So same sort of thing. In this case, no. This ransomware did not affect Mac computers. It was just unpatched versions of Microsoft Windows, right? From XP all the way up to Windows 10. But again, if you installed this patch that kind of came out in March, if you've updated your computer rather since March, and you're running anything from sort of Windows Vista all the way to Windows 10, then you'll probably be fine. But this does not affect Macintosh computers, but there are Macs that there are versions of ransomware that affect Macs out there. So we've got another question here. This one from Randy Serrett wants to know, is there an ability to get viruses by connecting to an infected Wi-Fi service? So the way this particular ransomware worked is, I think I mentioned earlier, that it's a worm, right? And worms are designed to sort of spread between computers as sort of fast as they can, right? You're trying to connect, or you're trying to spread between all of the computers on a network. And so in this particular case, right, a network could mean anything from computers physically plugged into the wall, or it could mean Wi-Fi, right? And of course there are exceptions, right? I mean, some networks are configured with certain security protections that might prevent this sort of thing from happening. Some networks might allow certain connections over Wi-Fi and disallow other connections, let's say. So, just connecting to a Wi-Fi network, won't necessarily mean that you're going to be infected, but, there is a possibility that if you have a computer that, hasn't been patched, that isn't up to date, and you connect to a network where, there is, this virus kind of going around, then there is a potential that, it could jump to your computer as well. I mean, the other thing that's worth pointing out as well is that, depending on how, people's computers are configured, right? Like if you just have a computer that's sitting at home and it's not patched, and you don't have a firewall, you have nothing, blocking your computer off from the wire, from the wider internet rather, it is possible to be infected just by having your computer sitting on the internet, if it hasn't been patched and if it has sort of certain, there's these things called ports. So, not to get sort of too into the weeds, but, if anyone's curious, computers, they don't just sort of connect to the internet over one big pipe. There's all these different sort of little things called ports, and different applications connect over different ports. And, typically that's why we have firewalls, right? They block people from the wider internet from connecting to your computer through certain ports. But if you don't have anything that's blocking those connections, then this ransomware can totally get into your computer from, the wider internet, just by virtue of your computer sitting there and being on. So that's something to kind of take note of as well. Another question. From Dwayne Scott, can we expect more variations of this malware in the future? That's a really great question, and that's something that I think a lot of researchers were worried about over this weekend because, this variant that we saw on Friday, it had a kill switch built into it. And I think there was a concern that, well, after everyone discovered this kill switch, what if the authors just released another version that removed the kill switch or changed the kill switch? And we actually saw this happen. So there was a second variant that some researchers discovered over the weekend, and, they, also found that this had another kill switch that they were able to disable. Those sort of cases, I mean, those it was good that we were able to sort of discover that kill switch and sort of shut that down. But now there's a concern that, the authors or maybe other authors who have reverse engineered this malware can then go and, modify it further, right? Maybe remove that kill switch entirely or change the way, it sort of infects computers, right? And that's sort of the concern right now. Now, the one thing that's sort of interesting is we haven't really seen that uptick in attack yet. And there's a few people online that have sort of been theorizing why that might be. And part of the reason might be the fact that, all of these variants that exist out right now, the ransoms that sort of they're demanding, they feed back into, I think I mentioned earlier, there's these 3 Bitcoin addresses, these 3 Bitcoin wallets that researchers have discovered. And, it's probably pretty risky right now for you to be the author of this malware trying to sort of recoup that money at this point, right? There's got to be lots of police and intelligence agencies that are keeping an eye on anyone who wants to try and sort of gain access to that, right? As I think the sort of theory. And so that might also be part of the reason why you haven't seen sort of an immediate sort of launching of another attack, which hopefully will give people, a bit of an opportunity to patch their systems and solve this particular flaw, right? That's allowing, this particular variant to spread. We're going to look at some more questions. Dennis Kronk, why is Bitcoin not blocking them or revealing who's behind it? So that's a great question. So one of the things you got to keep in mind about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is this decentralized network, right? There's not one person that controls Bitcoin, and this is by design, right? It's supposed to be this network that, everyone can kind of contribute to and participate in, and provides a certain degree of anonymity, right, and privacy to people who want to sort of send and receive money this way. And so it makes it really, really difficult for, like the person who runs Bitcoin to say, those are the people who run the sort of, the Bitcoin wallet behind this whole thing, because there's not one person who's in sort of a position to know who is behind particular Bitcoin addresses, right? The other thing to keep in mind as well is that, there's lots of ways that people can obscure their identities when they use things like Bitcoin. And so it makes it hard in some cases to actually track, who is actually behind a particular wallet. And so, it's really, really hard to kind of track down who runs particular wallets. And it's also hard to block things like this on the Bitcoin network. I mean, there's, the way that sort of Bitcoin is set up, you might, it's not the sort of thing where, there's sort of, again, like a central authority that can say, let's block all the transfers to that particular address. Unfortunately, it just does not work that way. And so as a result, the best that we can kind of do is tell people, stop paying the ransom, because it's been shown, I mean, this is one of the interesting things about this particular malware is that, traditionally, when you have sort of these ransomware schemes set up, right, there's usually some infrastructure on the back end that helps, the malware authors, handle all the payments and sort of, accept the payments and converse back and forth with, with their victims. And it tends to be automated to a certain degree, right, allowing them to sort of process a large number of transactions. But what researchers found in this case was that, well, no, actually, there was no automation involved in this case. It required human intervention to actually sort of, accept, these payments and then to deliver these sort of, keys in response to the payment. And so researchers were very quick to kind of say, like, don't pay these guys because you're not going to get your stuff back. There's not the infrastructure in place to be able to sort of, automatically give you the key when you pay. And so that's something kind of important to note as well. Sean Drummond on YouTube wants to ask, how does my elderly mom protect herself? So Sean, the best thing I would say for your mom is, and it's, sort of the advice that that I would give to a lot of people, which is, make sure she's running the latest version of, whatever operating system she uses, right? Make sure that, if you can, there's an option to turn on automatic updates, for example, so that your mom doesn't actually have to do anything, right? She'll use her computer, and then one day, it'll download updates in the background, and she won't won't have any idea what's happening, and then the next time she goes to turn off her computer, turn it back on, those updates will get installed automatically. And that's obviously not an option for everybody, but it is it's not an option for everybody, but it's definitely, if you can set it up that way, it's a really great way to make sure that you're getting the latest software updates without actually having to kind of know what's happening or do anything, right? And also, I shouldn't assume that your mom doesn't understand sort of how computers work and things like that. But if we're assuming that people who are a little bit less tech savvy, how do we kind of protect them? Yeah, turning on automatic updates, making sure they're using the most recent versions as possible of their operating systems, or at least supported operating systems, right? Maybe it's okay that you're not using Windows 10, but at least you have a version of Windows that's still getting updates and still being supported, and that's sort of a good way to help with that as well. The other thing I would mention too that's also really important is backups, right? I think for years, right, people have been talking about the importance of backups, and I think it's times like this that it's really, really important to remind people of how to set up a good backup strategy and how to make sure that you're protecting your important files, right? And so I'm sure a lot of people out there probably have drives that they connect to their computers every once in a while, and that's great because it means that if you get infected with something like ransomware, it's not going to necessarily spread to the drive if it's not plugged into your computer all the time. Some other people, for example, myself, I have a drive, it sits on my wireless network, my computer connects to it wirelessly. And so there's a chance that, yeah, if I get ransomware, that ransomware might jump from my computer to my drive and also encrypt everything on my drive. So how do you get around that? Well, depending on your level of comfort and sort of privacy and things like this, you might consider putting some things into cloud storage, right? So there's lots of different providers out there that you can look at to sort of store certain files in the cloud. And then that way, if all of your sort of local computers and drives and stuff get, totally destroyed by ransomware, at least you have a secondary backup that's, still sitting somewhere in the cloud. Or, maybe you make another backup every month that you kind of, keep in a safe or a shoebox or something, right? There's different ways that you can kind of go to protect yourself and make sure your data is protected in the event that you do ultimately get infected with one of these viruses. So we got another question from Malia Ravi, and she is wondering, is there any specific antivirus software we could use to avoid the virus infecting our system? So there's a lot of different options out there, and it sort of depends on what operating system you're using. On Windows, I hear a lot of people have recommended, just the default sort of, antivirus that comes installed with Windows is actually a pretty effective tool that you can use to give yourself a good sort of baseline level of protection. Now, antiviruses are kind of tricky, right? Because, some people like them and some people don't because, they can slow down your system. And there's also the thing to kind of remember too, which is that, an antivirus software is like any other piece of software. And there can be bugs in antivirus software too. And so I'd say, depending on sort of, how the level of protection, I guess, that you're sort of interested in, it's something that might be looking into, but I'd say the best thing you can do is just try and be vigilant when you're clicking on links, right? When you're downloading attachments, when you're opening emails and messages from people you don't know, right? These are all things that you can kind of help to really sort of reduce the risk of you getting something on your computer without having to kind of go out and sort of install an antivirus program, let's say. But, that is an option if you choose to go down that road, and I would say take a look at some of the default options that kind of come with Windows computers, and there's also sort of security protections in Macs as well that kind of help to deal with some of the sort of low-hanging fruit as well. Scott Paul Morgan asks, does this involve the cactusware virus? Scott, I got to be totally honest with you. I don't know what the cactusware virus is, but I'm going to look into it. I haven't heard of this, but I'm going to take a look, and I will write that down. So the next question I have, Michelle Landry wants to know, was this virus in an email attachment? And if so, how is this different from all the other ransomware spam people have been receiving for years? That's a great question. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, and I'll talk about it again for kind of those of you who are just joining us. So yeah, you look at a lot of the ransomware that's spread in the past, and a lot of the attack vectors are via email attachments, links, convincing people to visit malicious websites. That's how, criminals and malware authors have delivered this sort of stuff for a while. What made this particular instance unique, and part of the reason why it spread so fast, is it didn't actually require any user intervention for it to spread. It exploited this flaw that was built into Microsoft Windows, and what would happen is once it landed on an infected system, and we don't actually know how it first started to spread. I mean, it could have very well been an email attachment or something that was sort of the patient zero infection, but what made this so effective is once it infected a computer, it would scan for other vulnerable computers on the network, and once it found one, it would then jump to that computer and it would install itself, and then it would jump to that computer and it would install itself. And I mentioned earlier as well, it also had the ability to, install itself on computers across the internet. So, it could scan for vulnerable systems that were exposed to the internet, that didn't have any firewalls or things like that, and could jump onto them that way. And so this is sort of how it was able to spread to these vulnerable computers without anyone actually having to do anything, which is kind of scary. The sort of example that I heard a lot of researchers talk about over the weekend is they compared it to something called the Configure worm back in 2008. So if anyone remembers, there was a Microsoft worm, a worm rather, that affected Microsoft Windows machines, and it was the same sort of thing where it was able to sort of self-replicate and expand, or rather sort of jump from computer to computer to computer to computer. And same sort of thing I think we've been seeing sort of exhibited here, which is wild. So let's see. We've got another question here from Kulwinder Singh wants to know, will a standalone system get infected that is not within an architecture of client-server model? If yes, how? A standalone system get infected that is not within an architecture of clients. Okay, I think I see what you're saying. So you're wondering if sort of a standalone system that maybe doesn't have sort of other computers on a network, let's say, that maybe doesn't have, other sort of machines around it, can it still get infected? And the answer to that is, as I was explaining a second ago, if you have a computer that is connected to the internet and, hasn't been patched, and you don't have any protection, you don't have any firewall set up, you don't have anything blocking this particular sort of port that the ransomware requires to sort of jump onto other computers, then yeah, there's a chance that your computer could be affected as well. This is what makes this particular attack so dangerous, is that it's able to spread very, very quickly using using settings that are common to a lot of Windows machines. And so yeah, you don't necessarily need to be in a giant computer lab or a giant business, let's say. You could just easily have a computer that's unpatched, unprotected, and connected to the internet. Or maybe you have a computer that you take to a coffee shop or a library or something, and just by virtue of you connecting to that network, it's possible that you could also be infected that way as well. And so that's why it's really, really important that you patch your systems and that you make sure that your stuff is backed up. So let's see, I think we have a few more questions here. I'll take one more here from David Northcott, and if anyone has any more, send them in and I can maybe answer one or two more, and then we'll probably leave it at that. So David Northcott wants to ask, would a system restore fix the problem? It's a good question, and in this particular case, I'm not entirely sure. I know that system restore, the way it's supposed to normally function, is it's supposed to roll your system back to a previous state, right? It's supposed to sort of take your system and roll it back to a point where there wasn't an infection. And I think for that to work, it relies on the components, the system components that do a system restore to remain unaffected. And what you often find is that, when certain strains, and I don't know if this particular strain of ransomware does it, but, there's viruses and malware that, one of the things they try to do is they try to disable those mechanisms, right? They try to disable antivirus. They try to disable things like system restore so that, they make it harder for you to roll your system back easily to a point where it's usable. And I'm not entirely sure, but it would surprise me if it was as easy perhaps as doing sort of a system restore. I mean, the one thing to keep in mind as well is, some ransomware authors know that people want to be able to try to restore their systems, and so they might actually lock the restore files as well, right? And so you won't actually be able to kind of access those. But yeah, that's something that I will definitely look into and hopefully be able to find some more information for you. And we got one more question here. Malia Ravi wants to know, is there any specific antivirus we could use to avoid the virus infecting our system? So in this particular case, I think we found that what did we find in this case? To be totally honest, I'm not entirely sure. I would have to take a look and see whether any antivirus was able to detect this particular variant, because the way that antiviruses work is oftentimes, even if people make modifications to their ransomware, their malware, there can be signatures that are still unique to all those different versions, and so antivirus are able to pick it up. And certainly in this case, I mean, this ransomware is based on, this is the most recent variant of a version that I think researchers first spotted back in about February, and so it's been around for a little bit, a little bit of time, but it was modified, and most recently it was modified to have this worm-like behavior that allowed it to spread. But in this particular case, I think part of the reason why it was able to spread so quickly is because there were, I think certain antivirus softwares that weren't able to detect this particular variant, or didn't have antivirus installed, or were running, unpatched versions of Windows. And so as for specific antivirus that you could use to stop this particular attack, I'd have to take a look to know for sure. I mean, unfortunately, what ends up happening with a lot of these sorts of attacks is, especially ones that kind of come out of nowhere and they come, they happen really, really quickly like this, is that it takes a little bit of time for the people who work on antivirus software to be able to build new signatures that can detect these particular infections. And I'm not sure how quickly it took in this case for that to roll out, but something we can look into for sure. So I'm going to take one more here. One more from Sandra Neal. Where do we get the update from Microsoft? They stopped giving updates for Windows 7. So in this particular case, Microsoft, I think, looked at sort of the damage that was being done. They looked at the problems that everyone was having with things like Windows XP, with things like Windows 7, and they released a patch publicly for everyone to access. And so, there's certain versions of Microsoft Windows that are still supported by Microsoft. There's certain versions of Microsoft Windows that are no longer supported, but they'll still help you if you pay them. And then there's versions of Microsoft Windows that are just straight up not supported anymore. And what Microsoft did in this case is they took one of these patches for, their unsupported and paid support versions, and they basically said, you know what, we're going to release this for everyone to use because, clearly there's so much damage being done here. In Windows XP's case in particular, I think Microsoft called it a highly unusual move, right, for them to patch an operating system that's been outdated for so long. And so, if you want to download this particular patch, for sure, if you go on Microsoft's website, I know that they have links and instructions on how to access it there, and you should be able to find some information on how to upgrade your system that way and make sure you're up to date. So definitely take a look at Microsoft's website where they can kind of give you more information on how to do that. Okay, so I believe that's all the questions we have for now. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned some new things. I hope I was able to kind of clear some things up about this, most recent ransomware attack, how it's different, how it's affecting people, what you can do to protect yourself against this particular sort of attack, and also future ransomware infections as well. If you have any questions, I'm sure you can reach us. There's lots of different ways you can reach us. There's all of the Facebook pages and YouTube pages, which some of you might be watching this live. You can also contact me directly. My name, for those who, I'm not sure where it's displayed on the screen, but I'm Matthew Braga. Again, I'm the CBC's technology reporter. You can email me at matthew.braga@cbc.ca if you have any more questions. I can try my best to answer them, or maybe direct you towards someone who can. But otherwise, thanks for watching, and hope to chat and help you again soon.